In this tutorial, you'll learn how to solve a quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. We'll also discuss what the discriminant will tell you. So let's get started. If you're following along in your notes, please write this down with the appropriate page number. Alright, so let's talk about what we're going to learn today. Your learning target is that you can find the solutions of a quadratic equation using something called the quadratic formula. So in order to do that, you have to be able to write equations in standard form. That's ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You have to be able to identify what a is equal to, b is equal to, and what c is equal to. And then you have to substitute those values correctly into the quadratic equation. Now typically I'd write the quadratic equation here now, but it's pretty crazy looking, and I think I'm going to save it as a surprise for later. So let's review what we know about some quadratic functions. If you have a graph of a quadratic function, how do you find the solutions? Right? So if I were to ask you to find the solutions to this quadratic function, you should be looking here. Those are the solutions. And using a graph is easy because we can find the solutions just by inspection, right? That means just by using our eyeballs, not really doing any math. So one of the things that we want to make sure you understand is that a solution has a couple of other names. So if you're using a graph, you might call it the x-intercepts. The solutions are the same as the x-intercepts. So solution here is 1, 0, and the solution there is negative 2, 0. And you'll notice something in common about these two solutions, and that brings me to another name. Solutions are often called the zeros, and that's because the solutions always have a 0 value in that coordinate pair. So the last one that we discuss is a new word for you, and that's the roots. So if I say to you, find the roots of this quadratic, that would be the same as saying find the solutions. Now typically, I wouldn't use this word unless I was asking you to factor or solve using the quadratic formula. Alright, so let's get into these solutions. So this should look familiar to you. If you have an equation, right, a quadratic function, and I ask you to solve it, and we've studied this for a few weeks now, this should feel like something you know how to do. So to solve it means that you know that this is equal to 0. And some of the techniques that you've learned so far are factoring, or square rooting both sides if it's in vertex form that's been manipulated. And so for most of you, you should be thinking, okay, I'm looking for something that is the product, right, of negative 4, but is also the sum of 3. And if I know what that is, right, product of negative 4 and a sum of 3, then I've got factors of negative 4 and 1, and I could say that these factors are negative 1 and 4, and that the solutions are always the opposite of the factors, right? So that's something that should feel familiar to you. That's called solving a quadratic equation. Now, sometimes if I give you a graph or I give you an equation and I ask you to find the solutions, it's really not that easy. As you can see here, I can find the solutions, but I can't really be sure what their exact values are. I mean, I can estimate and I can guess. Looks like that might be a negative 1.5, but what if it's negative 1.59826? Right? That's not very specific and precise. So sometimes you can't solve a function by graphing it, and you can't solve it by factoring it, because there's nothing that multiplies to 16 that adds to negative 5. Well, technically there is, but they're just not integers, right? They're not those easy numbers that we can manipulate in our mind. So when these two methods fail us, you can use the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula works for every single equation. It would even work for this one. Even though we factored it, we can still use the quadratic equation. So the quadratic equation is like another tool, right? So you might have a hammer or a screwdriver or a wrench. So the quadratic equation, or the quadratic formula, I should say, the quadratic formula is another way of solving, of finding solutions, roots, or zeros, right? It's another way of solving without having to graph it. So there it is. What do you think? It's pretty scary looking. The good news is I'll provide you with that formula, but the funny thing is, as crazy as it looks, you're probably going to get pretty good at memorizing it. So I know it looks kind of scary, but you see all these variables that are in color? Those are from our standard form quadratic equation. And if you know what A is, and you know what B is, and you know what C is, you can substitute them in all the right places, right? That's all you have to do. Plug those values into all the right places. The good news is the calculator is going to do all the math for you today. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about one of the main ideas. A solution of a quadratic, as we discussed earlier, are the x-intercepts, or the value at which the quadratic crosses the x-axis. Now that can happen twice, that can happen exactly once, or that can happen never at all. And when this occurs, we call it having two solutions, one solution, or no solutions. And this is really the one we want to concentrate on. You know, if a quadratic equation has no solutions, why would I want to plug it into this fancy formula and do all of this work if it's not going to give me an answer? Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how can I find out if that's going to happen before I start doing all the heavy lifting, right? Before I start doing all the work, how can I find out if there's actually no solution? So in order to do that, we use a part of the formula first. This part here. It's called the discriminant. The discriminant is this expression that's underneath the radical sign. Now, if you have a radical sign, which in our case is a square root, right? If you have this square root sign, and it had the number, let's say 49 under it, and I asked you what the answer was, and you said 7, you technically wouldn't be right. Because technically there's two answers. Positive 7 times positive 7 makes 49, and negative 7 times negative 7 makes 49. But the thing is, even though there's two answers to this, there is no answer to this. Those are two totally different questions, right? You can have positive 7 times positive 7 and negative 7 times negative 7, but there's no combination of the exact same number that would give you a negative answer. I know a lot of you are thinking, well, what about this? But these aren't repeats. They're not a number squared, so you can't square root it. So anything that has a negative value, even if it's a perfect square number, if it's negative, it's not possible. So if your value underneath the radical sign is going to be negative, you know immediately that you have this situation. So why go through the hassle of solving the whole thing if you know this is going to be a problem for you? So we're going to practice using the discriminant. Again, the discriminant is used to determine how many solutions there are, right? Now, I've really only talked about this situation, right? If the discriminant is negative, there's no solution. But you can also tell using the discriminant if there's one of these types of solutions. And it's pretty basic. I know it's going to sound confusing, but it's pretty basic. So if you take the square root of the discriminant, which is this, if you take the square root of this and you get a negative number, any negative random number, you have no solutions. Now, if you take the square root of the discriminant and you get some random positive number, well, then you have two solutions. Okay, so some random negative number means you have no answer. But if you get some random positive number underneath here, like the square root of 57, or the square root of 25, or the square root of 3, all of those means that the problem has two answers. But anything like this means the problem has no answers. So how do we know if we have this? Well, this is a really special situation. And in order for this to happen, the discriminant, right? The discriminant, this value, has to be equal to a perfect 0. So if you get a positive 17, that's this. If you get a negative 3.7, that's this. But if you get a perfect 0, that's this. One real solution. All right, I know that's a lot of talking. Let's just take a look at it. Again, if the discriminant has a value that's negative, there are no solutions. If the discriminant has a random answer that's positive, you have two solutions. But if your discriminant is a perfect 0, you have just one solution. All right, let's take a look at an example here. State the value of the discriminant of 4x squared plus 5x equals negative 3. Then determine the number of real solutions of the equation. Okay, well, first thing I need to do is get it in standard form. And when I do that, this is my new sentence, right? Negative 3 comes over, becomes a positive 3. Now, in order for me to determine my discriminant, I have to know what A, B, and C are. So for us, A is 4, B is 5, and C is positive 3. And now I can find the discriminant. Remember, this is the formula. So the discriminant is this value. If the answer is positive, if the answer is negative, or if the answer is 0, then you can tell me how many solutions there are. If it's positive, there are 2 solutions. If it's negative, there are no solutions. And if it's 0, there is a perfect 1 solution. Now, I don't know what the solution is. It's not 1, right? It's not 2. But I do know that there will be 2 solutions, or there will be 1 solution. So let's take a look. B squared minus 4 times A times C. You're going to be doing a lot of this today. When you substitute a value in, you should replace it with parentheses. B is 5, A is 4, and C is 3. You turn your calculator on, right? Turn your calculator on. Whoops. Move this so you can see it. Sorry. It's being a little tricky today. There we go. Alright. So we're going to use it. And we are going to type 5 squared minus 4 times 3, right? So you can even include these parentheses. Parentheses 5 squared minus 4, parentheses 4, parentheses 3. And look at that. See, it looks exactly like what's written on my paper. Exactly what's on my paper is exactly what's going to go in the calculator. See that? And by doing that, I can get my answer. Now my answer is negative 23. Do you remember the rule? What happens if your answer is negative? That's right. This problem has no solutions. Alright, let's try another one. Find the values of the discriminant and determine the number of real solutions for the equation. Remember, you might need to write this down or look it up. This is the discriminant. Identify your 3 values. A is an invisible 1, B is negative 8, C is negative 20. Replace your variables with parentheses. B is negative 8, A is 1, and C is negative 20. Now this is one of those situations where using the parentheses is really important. Okay, so if you were to type negative 8 squared, and I were to type parentheses negative 8 squared, we're going to get 2 totally different answers. They look similar, but they're not. So it's important that you use these parentheses properly. So the quantity negative 8 squared minus 4, parentheses 1, parentheses negative 20, Now I know the bottom of my calculator is kind of off the screen, but hopefully you can see what's going on here. Oh, I gotta insert my parentheses here. Second, delete. That gives me an insert feature. Okay, that's better. All right, I got 144. Let me double check that. Negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times. No. So what happens? Now, that doesn't mean the answer to this quadratic, the solution is not 144. The discriminant is 144. And 144 is positive. So I don't know what it is, but this has two random solutions, right? This discriminant has two solutions. I don't know what they are. I just know that there are two. All right, let's try this one last time. A is 4, B is 20, and C is 25. Actually, before I get my calculator, let's do our skeleton. Discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. Parentheses squared minus 4ac. B is 20, A is 4, C is 25. Get your calculator out. A is 20, square it, minus 4 times 4 times 25. Double check it. Oh, check that out. So the solution to the discriminant is 0. Do you know how many solutions there are? That's right, there's one solution. I don't know what it is, but there's only one. All right, I think you're kind of catching on to this discriminant thing. It's your turn to give it a try. Don't forget that you need this formula. Pause the video now. All right, let's see how you did. Number 1 had no solutions. Number 2 had a positive answer, so it had 2 solutions. And number 3 had a 0 answer, which means there's 1 solution. All right, so that's kind of just the main idea of what the discriminant tells you. So sometimes doing a quick check will prevent you from having to do all this work if you know there's no solution to begin with. But now let's figure out, how do we determine what the actual solutions are? So step 1, make sure it's written in standard form. Step 2, take away all these variables and replace them with their appropriate values. And then step 2, it says here, simplify twice. And this is why. You see that funky sign? That's that plus minus sign. Oh, we've talked about that a couple times. I used it at the beginning when I asked you this question, right? And I said the answer was both plus and minus 7, right? So plus or minus sign means that you're going to use the sentence twice. You're going to use one of these sentences, b squared minus 4ac, and then you're going to use this sentence. I know I'm kind of squishing it in here, but do you see the difference? One time you're going to write it with a plus sign, and one time you're going to write it with a minus sign. And that's it. All right, so let me show you an example. Here we go. Step 1, make sure the equation is set to equal 0, and make sure it's written in standard form. It is. Step 2, identify A, B, and C. So I'm going to do that over here. A is 1. You can't see it, right? A is 1. B is negative 5. And C is minus 36, negative 36. So all I need you to do is to write that quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I know you don't have it memorized, and that's okay, because you're going to have the formula written down in your notebook. So you just have to copy that skeleton, and each time you're going to place these values into the correct spot. So this is a negative b. Now this is a negative from the formula, and 5 also has a negative. So that's going to be 2 negatives you're going to have to write. B squared, 4ac, and then 2a. All right, that looks pretty scary. So let's get to the calculator part. Now, this quadratic formula is a big, gigantic fraction. It's a big, gigantic fraction. So what we want to do is we want to enter that whole fraction into our calculator at one time. So let's see. I hope it's not too tiny for you. Okay. So in order to do that, I'm going to first create a new fraction. I'm trying to make this the perfect size for you. Here we go. And if you press alpha, y equals, you'll get that fraction option, right? Alpha, y equals. So I'm going to make a big giant fraction. And I'm going to type oh, I forgot. Negative, you can't see it here. Let me move this over. Negative 5. So I have a negative, parentheses, a negative 5, parentheses. And then this is where kids get confused. They say, well, what should I put? Should I put a plus? Should I put a minus? And the answer is, you have to put both eventually. So start with whichever one you want, right? I'm going to start with the minus. But you could start with plus if you want to. And now I'm going to choose the square root sign here. And now I'm going to start typing parentheses, negative 5, parentheses, squared, all right, minus 4, parentheses, 1, close parentheses, open parentheses, negative 36. And now to get to the bottom of the fraction, I'm going to press my down arrow. So I'm going to press 2, parentheses, 1. You see that? Now, as you start working, you're probably going to get a little lazy like me, and you're going to be like, why do I even need to type this? Because 2 times 1 is 2, and maybe you'll just leave it like that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's called being smart. So let's press enter and see what we get. Ah, that was pretty good. So I'm going to write that down because that is one of my 2 solutions. Or maybe I only have 1 solution. Let's find out. So instead of typing that whole long thing again, because oh my god, that took forever. Instead of typing that whole long thing again, I'm just going to arrow up. See, I was here. I'm going to arrow up twice. And I'm going to press the enter sign. And when I do that, it copies and pastes my entire fraction. Because my entire fraction is going to be the same, but this time, back arrow, back arrow, back arrow. I'm going to go all the way back. Ooh, sorry. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of the square root sign. Oh, sorry, it's taking my calculator a little longer to get there. Oh, so slow. Okay. Now, I'm almost there. There. Okay. So remember I said you need a plus and a minus sign? Well, last time I did a minus sign, so this time I'm going to do a plus sign. I'm just going to type right over it because everything else is perfect. So I'm going to press enter, and voila, my other solution. This is the only work I need you to show. The rest of the math should be done by your calculator. Alright, one more. Okay, solve the quadratic form algebraically. Algebraically means you can't graph it and then just use inspection, right? You can't just graph it on a graph and say, oh, it crosses at 4, it crosses at negative 9. They're going to want you to either solve it by factoring, completing the square, or your new favorite method, using the quadratic formula. So let's get started. All you need to write on your paper are the 3 values for the formula. 1, negative 12, and be careful here. That's a positive 20. Then you're going to set up the skeleton of your formula, removing all of the variables and replacing them with parentheses. And that's it. That is called showing your work. And that's not very hard. The next thing you do is replace all of these empty values with their correct replacements. So B, this is also B, this one is A, this one is C, and this one is also A. Turn your calculator on. Turn your calculator on, and if you cleared out your fraction from before, then you can just press alpha y equals fraction, and then you start typing. What have we got here? Negative 12. Be careful, that's important. A negative, parentheses, negative 12. Oh, didn't go. Gotta Gotta go back and type it again. What is wrong? Negative, parentheses, negative 12. Now, if you're real smarty pants, you're just going to leave that as a positive 12. Alright, again, your choice. You can write positive or you can write negative. This time I'll write a positive. So then I do the square root. Now this time you need to write the parentheses and the negative. I'm going to square that. I'm going to subtract 4 times A times C. And then I'm going to write 2 times 1, right? Okay, so my first answer is 10. So I'm going to write that down. And now again, arrow up, press enter. That's a copy and paste feature. Press the back arrow, back, 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 or up arrow, up, up, up. And move that cursor until it gets right in front of the square root sign. And remember what we're going to do here? We're going to change that plus sign to a minus sign. That's it. Okay, and there is the solution to this quadratic equation. Alright, are you picking up on it? I think you're ready to try these two on your own. Pause the video now. Alright, let's see how you did. Okay, you see on this second question we worked here, number 5, that one of the answers happened to be a fraction, or a decimal. That happens sometimes. And if it does, you round to the place value indicated. So this one says round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So I rounded, well, I didn't need to, 1.5 didn't need to be rounded, but it goes to the tenths place. 1.5. Alright, so let me show you one where maybe you do need to do a little bit of rounding. Okay, identify your parts. A equals, B equals, C equals, right? That's the first thing you always do. Once you identify your 3 values, you set up your skeleton. You're going to start getting used to this. Then you fill in your pieces. Then you turn on your calculator. You type it all in. And you're going to get some really long decimals. So I want you to type in this, this right here. I want you to type that in for me, because I have the answer already. But I want you to type it in your calculator and see if your answers, when rounded, would give you the same responses that I got. Okay, so pretty much the bulk of this lesson is you knowing how to use your technology, right? Knowing how to use that graphing calculator to find these 2 values. Because you're not going to do any math. The calculator is going to do all the math. But you have to type it in appropriately and correctly. So this is really a calculator lesson. Alright, I think you're ready to try these last 2. I think you're really getting the hang of it, and these 2 will need to be rounded. Alright, pause the video now. Okay, let's see how you did. Did you get those right? Well, now you know exactly what to do. That is how you use the quadratic formula. It can be used on every single equation whenever you want. If it's your favorite form of solving, because you hate factoring, or you hate completing the square, or you hate square rooting, then this is an easy way to do it. Okay? Now, in the next lesson, I'm going to teach you one other thing where I won't allow you to necessarily use the calculator to give me a decimal response. But for now, this concludes the lesson on the quadratic formula. So I'm going to show you one more equation, right? And I want you to think about all the things we've learned. So these are all the things we've learned. You can factor a quadratic equation, you can graph it, you can use square roots on both sides, you can complete the square, or you can use the quadratic formula. So here's that last equation I said I was going to show you. X squared minus 4x equals 12. And I can use any method I want to solve this problem. Sorry, I wrote it wrong. X squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0. Right? I can use any method that I want. But why am I going to dig out my calculator, write down that whole funky formula, when I know that negative 12 as a product and negative 4 as a sum is pretty quickly found with these two values, right? You saw how quick we did that? So I can certainly use the quadratic formula on this, but sometimes the numbers are so friendly that you should just go with the easiest method of solving. All right, so I know the answers to this are -2 and +6, and I did that without having to do the quadratic formula. So again, these are all of the methods we've learned, and hopefully when I say to you, solve algebraically, you'll use one of these 4 things. Now, if I say solve algebraically, you can't solve by graphing. If I say solve by graphing, then you can't use any of these. Okay? All right. So hopefully you feel confident in all of these 5 methods, and that concludes this lesson.